Happy Thursday, everybody. My name is Steve, and welcome to Rank the World, the podcast where a young white guy shares what he thinks about a variety of topics in a tier list format, because that's exactly what the world needed more of. Now, for those of you listening for the first time, this is what I like to call a homemade podcast, meaning I'm not recording in a full studio. I do use a nice XLR microphone with an audio interface, but that's just about where the list of professional equipment ends. I'll do my best to minimize background noise, but if an airplane goes by or a car alarm starts or my neighbors start jumping up and down while I'm in the middle of talking, I'm not going to start the whole thing over. Sound like a deal? Okay. And one last thing before we begin. If you enjoy this podcast and want to see more of what I make, go check out my Linktree at linktree/DerHerrSturm. That's linktr.ee/DerHerrSturm. That's got links to my Twitch, my YouTube, my SoundCloud, and Twitter, where you can stay up to date with what I'm doing and when I'm doing it. But definitely not the same sort of content as you can hear here. But who knows? You may find a thing or two worth enjoying. Now that that's out of the way, let's get started with today's topic, which, seeing as this is the pilot episode and all, it's going to be media that I've finished, whether that be films, games, or other series. As a matter of fact, it's exactly those three things. Now, this list is not like a full comprehensive list of absolutely every film and series and game I've ever finished, but I think it's a good mesh of a lot of the stuff I enjoy, and I think because of that, it's a good it gives a good glimpse as to who I am as a person. So, without further ado, It's a standard tier list, 6 tiers, S, A, B, C, D, and F. Any of you listening at home who have seen a tier list before, you know what that means. S is good, F is bad. It's just about simple as that. Now, the first entry we have here is Airplane, the classic comedy film from, when was it? I want to say the 80s? The 1980 American parody film. Now, it's been a long time since I last saw this, but I have seen it a good couple times, and you know what? It's not the most groundbreaking film out there, but if that's the kind of thing you enjoy, but it's a decent film. It's fun. That's what it is. It's fun, and I think because it's got some good comedic performances from some of the cast, and I think because of all that, I'm gonna have to give it a B. I think it's a solid entry into B tier. Next up, we have All the Way, featuring Bryan Cranston and Anthony Mackie. It's a film that documents, well, not really documents, but it tells the story of how Lyndon B. Johnson, President Lyndon B. Johnson, got the Civil Rights Act of 1965, I believe, passed through the chambers of Congress. Really good performances all around. I'm a sucker for Bryan Cranston, and I think more importantly than that, it has some really good cinematography. It's made really well. It's very reminiscent, for me at least. It's a good combination between Vice from 2018, starring who was it? I think starring Christian Bale. Similar sort of. Both of these are biopics, I would say, but Vice covers Vice President Dick Cheney from the Bush Jr. administration. We're not going to be covering Vice here today, but the other one it reminds me of, Lincoln, starring Daniel Day-Lewis. That one we're going to be talking about later in just a bit here. But All the Way, I'd say it's a solid A tier. Maybe once we're done, and I give the whole list another once over, I might move it up to S, but for now, A tier. Now, for a completely different change of pace, Adam Sandler's Click from 2006. It's something. It's definitely something. I'll give it that. Is it a film? I wouldn't say it's a film. Is it a movie? Yes, it is definitely a movie. I think Click is one of those films where you have to know what kind of movie it is going in, or else you are not going to enjoy it. I went into it knowing it was not a good film. It was not a phenomenal movie. And I think because of that, I was able to get a lot more enjoyment out of it. But I think objectively, this is a D tier movie. It's not very good. The plot it's very predictable. The structure and the humor, it's very lowbrow. I think it's one of those movies where I would say it's so bad it's enjoyable. I would say it's one of those films, like not necessarily like The Room, but it's closer to The Room than it is to something like All the Way. Next up, we have Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Admittedly, it has been a few years since I've seen it, but for like in 80s, 90s film, because that's definitely what it feels like in terms of production value and in terms of just how the media's aged, I would say it's pretty good. It is a very enjoyable story, very enjoyable performances, especially by Matthew Broderick. Not as good as All the Way. I don't think it quite gets into A tier. But you know what? B is for Bueller. I think it goes into B tier. Next we have Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket. Now I know that this movie is regarded as one of the greats by a lot of film critics, by a lot of film enthusiasts. And I get a lot of the appeal that it has. It's a very gritty, arguably very realistic story. Cinematography is amazing. And Stanley Kubrick's direction is really, really good. I personally am not that big on Full Metal Jacket, especially the second half. However, putting that aside, I think objectively, at worst, Full Metal Jacket is an A tier film. I'm not sure if I'll move it up to S tier, but definitely for now, I think Full Metal Jacket deserves A tier. Next is The Irishman, starring Al Pacino, Robert De Niro, the whole 9 yards. Here's the thing about The Irishman. It is a long, long film. 3.5 hours. I think if you watched it all in one sitting, you might not, unless you are like a film buff, I don't think you would think as highly of the movie as if you did what I did and separated it into like a few sittings. I watched the movie across like 2 or 3 sittings, and although it's not like a huge bombastic story, I would say it was still compelling. And because of that, especially because of the cinematography and the performances from, again, Al Pacino, Robert De Niro, I think it's definitely a shoo-in for A tier. It might be able to move up to S. Next up we have Joker from 2019, starring Joaquin Phoenix. Here's the thing about Joker. I really enjoyed this movie. I think it is shot really well, and I think above all else, Joaquin Phoenix's performance was really good, but where this movie I think really shines is its sound design, especially for a cinematic viewing experience. I think unless you saw this movie in the theaters, I don't think you got the full experience of this film. Now, this is probably true for a good majority of the films here, just because of the technologies behind like an actual theater setting versus like a home theater or just watching it on your laptop with some headphones. But I have yet to be as immersed in a movie by its sound design as I was when I saw Joker. Now, without that, this would be a B tier film. It does have a decent amount of not especially thought-provoking, but the way that it's structured makes you think and makes you question as to how much of what you're seeing in the film actually happened. Like how much of it is actually real versus how much of it are Arthur Fleck's, Joaquin Phoenix's character's delusions and hallucinations. But I think because of the cinematic experience carried by the sound design, I think it is another A-tier film. Next up, we have Knives Out, which sort of similar situation to Joker, but instead of sound design, I think it is really carried by its characterization. I think the cast of Knives Out is a really fun cast, a lot of really good characters, especially in how dynamic they are with one another, excuse me. And if I'm being honest, in terms of the theatrical viewing experience, I enjoyed Knives Out just about as much as I enjoyed Joker. So not to sound like a broken record here, but I think Knives Out is a shoo-in for A tier. Next up, we have arguably one of the greatest films I have ever seen, or at least one of my personal favorites, Daniel Day-Lewis's Lincoln. I think Lincoln perfectly exemplifies everything good about all the films I've put into A tier so far. Very compelling performance by Daniel Day-Lewis, much like All the Way, although not necessarily in the same fashion. It tells the story of how President Abraham Lincoln worked to get the 13th Amendment passed in the House of Representatives, which was a very difficult process, and as a matter of fact, I did not have more to say about that. I started that sentence expecting to have more to say, and no, I didn't. That was where the train of thought ended. But I think because of all that, S tier film, without a doubt. There's no doubt in my mind that S tier is where Lincoln belongs. Moving on to Netflix's Marriage Story, starring Scarlett Johansson and Adam Driver. Although not necessarily as good of cinematography or sound design as Lincoln or as a Joker, definitely this movie is carried, well, maybe not carried, but one of the strongest components of this film are Johansson and Driver's performances. Especially one of the final scenes where the two just argue. I think this film does a really good job illustrating the difficulties that come with the separation of a marriage, of divorce. And just because of their performances, most definitely, Marriage Story belongs in A tier. Next, we have Memento. Definitely out of all the films that we'll be talking about here today, the most unorthodox way of structuring a story. And when you do it the way Memento does, because the way Memento does it, it does not show you the sequence of events in chronological order. It sort of splits the whole thing up into a bunch of segments and then rearranges everything. So it really makes the audience, it really makes you think about what's happening, think about the information you are being presented and how it connects to everything you've seen already and everything you are going to see. And because of that, apart from Airplane, for completely different reasons, I think Memento has one of, if not the best rewatch values out of every movie we are going to talk about today. Airplane, a lot of the rewatch value is just because of how much stuff they put in the background it's just something that you notice every time you rewatch a movie. You notice more and more stuff in the background. With Memento, it's more so, now that you've seen the whole picture before, now you're picking up on subtle hints laced throughout that you may not have noticed the first time around. And I think because I'm not 100% certain on this, but I am pretty sure that Memento was one of, if not the first movie to do this. And I think because of how well it stitches everything together, it doesn't make them think, what is going on, in a negative sense. It's more so a sense that builds intrigue and not frustration. And I think because of its capability of doing that, I think Memento is an S-tier film. Up next, we have 1 Hour Photo starring Robin Williams. Now this, along with a good deal of movies I've seen in the past year, I discovered this film. I didn't see the whole thing, but I discovered this film probably like a lot of people in my age group and younger are exposed to media nowadays. I found clips of it while scrolling through TikTok. And personally, those clips did not prepare me for what kind of film this was. This film, it shows Robin Williams. Well, it doesn't show. Robin Williams performs, I think, unlike anything I had seen him perform before. And I think he did a very good job with his character's role. Because without giving up too many spoilers, this movie gets unsettling. Not quickly, but it definitely gets unsettling as the movie goes on. And Robin Williams worked with that premise a lot better than I expected him to. So I think because of that, A-tier film. Now on a much, much different note, Paddington 2. Now I have not seen the first Paddington, so there's probably context, stuff like Peter Capaldi's character's motivations that I do not understand as well as I would if I had seen the first Paddington. But Paddington 2 is a delightful film. It is positively delightful. Paddington is an absolute sweetheart. And just the way he affects the environments around him and the characters he encounters, even when he goes to prison, it is just a heartwarming film and a delight to watch. So because of that, easy A tier. Easy A tier. It's no phenomenal piece of storytelling, nor is it a cinematic masterpiece, but it is delightful. On the other hand, we have Paul Blart Mall Cop. Now, while this film may not be delightful, much like with Adam Sandler's Click, if you go into this movie knowing what to expect in terms of tone, in terms of production value, in terms of storytelling quality, if you know what you're getting into, you're going to have fun with this film. However, I cannot put it into B tier. I cannot put it in the same tier as Airplane and Ferris Bueller's Day Off in good conscience. So because of that, we are going to have our first entry into C tier for the day. To me, definitely better than Click, but it just doesn't have what it takes to break past C tier. Now, for what may be a relatively unknown movie, I don't know. I had not known about this movie until I had seen it with a group of friends. Robot and Frank. Now, if you haven't seen the movie, the premise of the movie is there's this old man, Frank. He's getting really old. His brain isn't what it used to be. He's starting to forget a few things. So one of his kids gifts him a robot caretaker. And at first, Frank's like, "Oh, I don't like this. I don't like this robot. I just wanna do my own thing." But then he figures out, "Oh, I can teach this robot to help me steal like the good old days." And then he starts to buddy up with the robot. And without spoiling anything further, I'll leave it there. But considering I did not know anything about this film before I saw it, I enjoyed it a lot more than I expected, even more so than I had expected upon like the first 10 minutes of viewing it. And I think in its own strange sort of way, it's a fun watch. Definitely not as fun as like Paul Blart, if you know what it is going into it, or as delightful as Paddington 2, but it's a pretty good movie. It's a decent film. And I think because of that, I think it deserves to be in B tier. Now, next we have a relatively recent release. I think it just came out last October. Smile. Now, this was I think the first movie I had seen in theaters probably since the COVID-19 pandemic started. And again, I knew absolutely nothing about this film going into it. I don't even think I knew it was a horror film. It was a big scary movie until like the movie started. And admittedly, the premise is very simple, and it doesn't do too much like outlandish or super original with that premise. However, at the same time, just like looking at it not in context of other things around it in its genre, just looking at the film by itself, it utilizes like that uncanny that concept of an uncanny, creepy smile decently well. There were a good few moments where it legitimately took me off guard with how scary it was. Two specific like scares that come to mind. One scene early on in the movie where the protagonist is alone in their house shortly after they get this curse, and like they're looking on into like a very dimly lit portion of their open kitchen, and just really faintly in the background you can see the face that she had first saw when she got this curse placed on her of a really, really wide and creepy smile. That I think that got me better than any other scare in the film, just because of how unsettling it was. And then there was another sort of jump scare later on in the movie where the protagonist's sister walks up to the car and knocks on the door, and then like her head comes down, swivels down, and then you got the big orchestra string? What am I saying? Orchestra sting that plays. And although I did see that coming a little bit, it was still good. It got me a decent amount. So I think because of that, it goes into B tier. Not quite good enough to break out into A, but I mean, it's no Paul Blart Mall Cop, come on. Next we have The Social Network, starring people like Andrew Garfield, Jesse, what's his last name? I can never remember his last name. Jesse Eisenberg. And I think Justin Timberlake too. If you haven't seen the movie, it pretty much covers, it's not necessarily like 100% truthful, this is how Facebook was started. It more so covers the depositions that Mark Zuckerberg was involved with. At the same time, though, I think the performances were very compelling, especially from Andrew Garfield. Good cinematography, and even though if you look at it on its own in a vacuum, the soundtrack on its own isn't anything super special or complex or compelling. When it's paired up with the film, it gives the film character. And I think it really accentuates all the cinematography and performance around it. And I think because of that, even though it may not quite get into S, I think it's a shoo-in for A tier. All right, next we have Disney's The Sorcerer's Apprentice, starring Alfred Molina and Nicolas Cage. I'll be honest, this film is not the greatest film you're ever going to see. It's not the greatest movie you're ever going to see. But like Paul Blart and like Click, and like Ferris Bueller and like Airplane, maybe not like Robot and Frank, but like the others I've mentioned so far, if you know what kind of movie it is when you're getting into it, you're going to have a fun time. Narrative isn't anything groundbreaking. CGI is pretty good. The effects are pretty good. Cinematography is nothing to write home about. Neither is the soundtrack. Nothing about this film is stellar. But everything about it put together, it's decent. It's fun. And I think because of that, it deserves to join Paul Blart, Mall Cop, in C tier. Next we have Steve Jobs. Much like Lincoln, much like All the Way, much like Vice, even though we're not covering Vice, this movie is a biopic that, well, not like a biograph. You know what I mean. It's like Lincoln, it's like All the Way, where it depicts what happened like behind the scenes before a lot of the big announcements of his career, like the first Macintosh, that Cube computer he made after he got fired from Apple, and then the iMac. And it also depicted Steve's relationship with his daughter and just illustrating who he was as a person. Because I think Steve Jobs' personality really gets overshadowed by the things that get tied to him, like the iPhone, the Mac, all that. And I think this movie handled that very well. Cinematography, beautiful. Performances were really good. I was surprised at how well Seth Rogen handled his serious performance of Steve Wozniak. Usually when you think of Seth Rogen, you think of the Seth Rogen summer blockbuster comedy films. This is not the Seth Rogen that is in Steve Jobs. I want to say this is like Seth Rogen as we've never seen him before, but who knows? We might have seen him before. We might see that from him again. But I really enjoyed this movie. And I think it is just about as good as The Social Network and All the Way were. And because of that, it goes into A tier. Whiplash, starring J.K. Simmons. Oh my God. Oh my God, are the performances compelling. And even though the story doesn't have any super high stakes, it puts so much tension into what's going on. The performances are stellar. The cinematography is stellar. This is not Interstellar, but God, it is an S-tier film. It is an S-tier film. I will stand by that statement. I think it is just as good as Lincoln and Memento. Now shifting gears a little bit, we're going to be going into our first batch of games and our largest batch of games. Again, this is not every game that I've played, but this is a decent selection of the stuff I've played and the stuff I enjoy. First off, Beat Saber. Virtual reality rhythm game where you get two lightsabers. Well, not necessarily lightsabers, but pretty much lightsabers, and you like cut through blocks to the rhythm of whatever music is playing. I would say definitely a must-buy game for people who like own virtual reality headsets. A ton of replay value, especially if you like rhythm games or virtual reality games at all. And really, not the best way, but a decent way to get some exercise and enjoy yourself while you're doing it. The gameplay, nothing groundbreaking, but it's just good enough to really want you to play more. And I think because of that, solid B tier game. Now, Bendy and the Ink Machine. This game was recommended to me by one of my close friends in the early days that I was streaming. I streamed the whole game. The art style, I would say, is really good. But that is about where the praise I can give this game ends. Personally, I don't like the controls of the game. I don't like the gameplay loop. I didn't find the story all that compelling. And apart from like a few exceptions, I did not like the voice acting performances that were in Bendy and the Ink Machine. So although it's a beautiful game, well, I wouldn't say like beautiful like things like Amori or like Zelda Breath of the Wild, but the art style works really well. I think the art style works in this game's favor. But in a game, the gameplay comes first. And I don't know, I think we might have our first entry into F tier. Again, if you like this game, all the power to you. Just me personally, I don't like it. There's definitely, you can glean some enjoyment from it, just not me. Next up, we have Castle Crashers, a 1 to 4 player co-op like beat 'em up adventure game. This was one of the first like full multiplayer games I ever played, and I really enjoyed the gameplay of this game. The art style, much like Bendy and the Ink Machine, is very cohesive, gives the game a lot of personality, and unlike Bendy, really good. Well, Bendy has a decent soundtrack, but I think Castle Crashers, the cohesiveness is not just in the art style. It's also in the gameplay. It's also in the very simple story. It's in the character designs, and it's in the soundtrack. I think all of those elements complement each other really well, and it ties everything together in a very, very enjoyable game experience. So I think Castle Crashers is a shoo-in for A tier. Next up, we have Doom. Not the original, like 1993 Doom, not the thing you play, not the game you played on your really old PC or your Super Nintendo or your Sega Genesis. No, not that. This was the sort of reboot game that came out in 2016. Although like Dead by Daylight, it has not a super original art style. It's still cohesive, and like Castle Crashers, it is well tied together by its gameplay loop, by its soundtrack. Doom 2016, I think, is the best reboot for the Doom series that anyone could have hoped for. And I think because of that, it's a shoo-in for A tier. Now, its sequel, Doom Eternal, very similar in a lot of ways, but where Doom 2016 was cranked at a 9, Doom Eternal is cranked in at 13. It goes the extra mile, adds a few gameplay mechanics that I think ended up fitting really well, and I think Doom Eternal is S tier. Now, shifting gears a little bit, I'm not sure if it's an indie game, but definitely a game that probably fewer people are familiar with than the other entries we've discussed already. It's a little thing I found on Steam called If on a Winter's Night, 4 Travelers. Now, the reason that it caught my eye is because at the time, I was reading a book of a similar title, If on a Winter's Night, a Traveler, by Italo Calvino. Now, the premise of the book, well, at first it starts off telling like a story of, a man on a train, and then it cuts away to the story of a person reading that story, and how that story is a manuscript that cuts off at a certain point, and then it sort of becomes a meta-narrative about the protagonist trying to figure out what the full original like text was at, and each time they find a new revision or translation or whatever of that first story that abruptly ended, the book then cuts to that very adaptation or translation or whatever. While If on a Winter's Night for Travelers somewhat follows a similar formula, it takes it in a different direction. The premise of the game is you are on a train. A train seemingly going to the afterlife. And the way that all this is sort of framed is that it's a masquerade. And like the main character then encounters someone who had either recently or whatever had died. And as this new character tells their story, instead of just us reading this recently deceased person's story, we get to play the series of events leading up to their death. And the way in which it utilizes this storytelling mechanic, even though the gameplay is nothing super engaging, it's engaging enough to serve as an effective vehicle for the narrative the story's trying to tell. And in addition to that, I think the art style in which the game utilizes a very pixel art, very minimalist art style, I think is very effective. However, I don't think it's compelling enough of an experience to quite make it into A tier, so into B tier it will go. Changing gears a little bit, we're going to talk about LEGO Star Wars: The Complete Saga. Now, LEGO Star Wars is a very near and dear series to my heart. LEGO Star Wars 2, one that centers around the original trilogy, was one of the first video games I ever played. And I don't think the LEGO formula has ever been as good or ever will be as good again as it was in LEGO Star Wars: The Complete Saga. Up until that point, LEGO games had a very specific charm to them where it was sort of like Buster Keaton or Charlie Chaplin films, where it had a very specific personality to them that was conveyed entirely through nonverbal expressions. And I think because of that, a very specific style of comedy and parody was able to develop with those LEGO games. And I don't know, just after this game came out, it was never quite the same. Admittedly, gameplay loop isn't that complex, but the way in which it utilizes that loop and iterates upon it the more of the game you play gives it a tremendous amount of replay value, and that is where I think this game really shines. So I think because of that, even though it's not a very complex game, it is still very fun, and you can milk it so much for probably hundreds and hundreds of hours of enjoyment. So I think because of that, it's an A-tier game. Next up, we have Minecraft. The best-selling video game of all time. Extremely simple premise. It's a cube world. You can do pretty much anything. While there are some objectives you can complete, like finding diamonds, going to the Nether, fighting the Ender Dragon, stuff like that. Really what this game is about is leaving it up to the player. Having the limits of the game be the player's imagination. And I think because of that, because of how much potential the game has, and how much stuff you can do with it, and how much agency it gives to the player, not even to mention how cohesive the art style is with the soundtrack and the sound design, it's an easy S tier. Easiest S tier of the day. Now this next game, you might not have heard about it. It's a game called NeoCab. The premise of the game is you are a cab driver in like a neopunk future version of San Francisco, I think it is. It's some metropolitan area, and the two places where this game really shines are its storytelling and its art direction. The art direction is very vibrant, high contrast, feels very cell shaded, very cohesive, and works well with the tone the game is setting. The narrative, it's compelling, not anything super groundbreaking, but I think it's very effective at making the player think about some aspects of our society that are exacerbated in the setting of the game. I don't remember too much about the soundtrack, but at the same time, I don't remember anything about it like detracting from the overall experience of the game. This is one of those games that has multiple endings. It's very dependent on player choice, which I really like to see in games, seeing as they are a form of interactive media, and as such can be subject to a more interactive form of storytelling. And I think because of all that, I would put Neocab in A tier. Now for another, possibly lesser known indie game, probably for different reasons, called Octodad Dadliest Catch. Now probably where a lot of the personality of this game comes from are its art direction, its extremely simplistic story, and its control scheme. At times, the control scheme of this game can get very infuriating. However, where a lot of people call them rage games, like Getting Over It with Bennett Foddy, games like that, where the control scheme can be infuriating, where that can detract from the overall experience and tone of the game, I think with Octodad, it bolsters it, because the premise of the game is you, the player, are playing as an octopus that is masquerading as a dad. That is the premise of the game. And I think because of that situation, like an octopus trying to pretend to be human, that control scheme makes a lot of sense. There's going to be a lot of confusion if you're an octopus trying to be not an octopus. And overall, it's a very fun, very funny game. So I think because of that, although it's not groundbreaking or not phenomenal in any of those regards, it is a solid B-tier game. Now shifting gears a little bit, we're going to be talking about some horror games, of which I believe I have 3. And the first one is Outlast. Now the premise of the game is you are playing as an investigative reporter, and what you are investigating is a rundown, not a super rundown, but definitely an infamous asylum called Mount Massive. You go in there, you get trapped, you can't really fight your way out because you're not a fighter, so pretty much you're supposed to run and hide to survive. And the game pretty much chronicles that journey of this investigative reporter simply finding themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time and trying their best to survive in this really, really dangerous environment. I think the way that they implement this sort of first-person control, the way they implement the equipment that an investigative reporter would have in this situation in the gameplay mechanics, I think is really well done. And the game's story does a good job at building intrigue in the player. However, it's not really groundbreaking in that regard. However, all in all, very fun game. One of the most enjoyable horror games I've ever played. So I think for those reasons, it goes into A tier. And in tandem with Outlast, covering Outlast Whistleblower, which was a sort of alternate story DLC that came out after Outlast did. And the premise of this one is that it is following a similar journey by an employee in the Mount Massive Asylum that sort of kickstarts the investigative reporter's story in the first Outlast by being a whistleblower. They provided the lead that reporter had to go into the asylum in the first place. This story sort of intertwines with the story of the main game of Outlast. It starts way before the main game started and ends after the main story ends. And I think the way they sort of weave this gameplay, using this story, using characters that were familiar in the original game while still introducing some new ones, How they sort of handled constructing this whole thing, I think was really well done. Out of the two, I prefer the story of Whistleblower, but I prefer the gameplay flow of the first Outlast. And then moving on, I think this is the last horror game we have for the entire episode, Slender the Arrival. Now I have a bit of nostalgia for this game, and really Slender Man as a concept. It was really my first experience into this sort of found footage genre of horror. And upon more recent playthroughs of the game, they have changed the game a good deal from when it first came out. At the same time, though, the art direction has sort of aged. It does show its age from when it first came out in 2013, I think it was, 2012, 2013, around that area. It definitely builds in uneasy tension with its art direction and the overall gameplay flow. There are games that do it better, but this is definitely an enjoyable enough experience. So for those reasons, I put Slender the Arrival in C tier. So now going back to every other genre of game ever, we're going to be talking about Overwatch 2. Me personally, I really enjoy the gameplay. I really enjoy the characters. I enjoy the art style. I enjoy the world that Blizzard is trying to build with Overwatch 2. I don't think it's all there quite yet in a really cohesive package, but I can definitely tell that they're trying to build something special. Whether or not they'll get there, we'll see. But the way it is right now, it's very much carried by its gameplay. It's not balanced perfectly, but it's definitely in a playable, sort of healthy format. So I think because of all that, it's a solid B tier. Next is Plants vs. Zombies. One of the indie games ever. Really simple gameplay loop. It's a simple tower defense. Well, not really tower defense, but it's a simple, like, wave defense sort of game. Nice art style, gives it a lot of personality. And again, in terms of length, it falls just within that sweet spot where it ends right around where you would get tired of the formula. For those reasons, B tier again. And a very simple premise. There are zombies that want to get into your house. You have to use plants to keep them out. Next, we have Punch-Out for the Wii. In terms of gameplay, it is amazing. So much fun. It's just a simple, like, cartoonish, you're in the boxing ring. But I think in terms of, like, controls and the gameplay loop, it's really fun. It's really good. Not a really complex premise at all. You're just, like, trying to climb up the ladder of beating stronger and stronger opponents until you're the strongest out there. And then you defend your title against, like, these previous opponents. Very simple, but very fun. Easy B tier. Now talking about a smaller series, we're going to be talking about the Portal series. Portal 1, it introduced a really interesting gameplay loop and mechanic, solving puzzles with portals. I don't think there had been a game like it before, and I don't think there's a game quite like it since. The art style, while somewhat realistic, it does have a compelling and different enough set design and environmental design that it really builds a distinct personality to the game. Not super long and not a super compelling narrative, but it's compelling enough. And what's interesting about it is that a good majority of it, the storytelling about the world in which it takes place, a lot of it is told through the environment, which I don't think has happened nearly to the degree that happens in the first Portal game, in any other game or movie really that we've talked about so far. So for those reasons, in addition to its pretty satisfying gameplay loop, I'm going to put it into A tier. Now its sequel, Portal 2, it takes everything that the first Portal did right and just sprints with it. It adds a much more compelling story. It adds more character to it. It builds upon the personality that the first game brought up. It adds more details about the world in which the game takes place. Easy S tier. Easy S tier entry. We've got 6 games left, so first of those final 6 is South Park: The Stick of Truth. Pretty much the best way I can summarize this game is it is the perfect translation of South Park as a TV show into a video game. It translates everything that makes South Park while making it interactive. Pretty much the premise is the South Park kids are playing a big fantasy game, while at the same time there are like government conspiracies and aliens all in the background that eventually make themselves the forefront of the game's story. So if you like South Park, you'll probably like this game. It's a turn-based RPG while still feeling like the show. And I think for those reasons, it's at least a B tier. Not the greatest or most compelling game you'll ever play, but still a very fun experience. Next we have the Stanley Parable. In terms of gameplay, it is not super interesting. In terms of art style, and in terms of general cohesion and overall experience, it's very good. It really takes a crack at the element of choice in a video game, really focuses in on that, and I think because of that, it really shines. So although if you're looking for really interesting, really intriguing gameplay, you're going to have to look elsewhere. But I think in terms of setting out to do what it has done, it's hard to beat. So for all those reasons, the Stanley Parable is an A tier. Now for Super Hot, the second of only 2 VR games I'm going to be covering today. Definitely much more compelling gameplay than Beat Saber, but the trade-off there is it doesn't nearly have the amount of replay value that Beat Saber has. However, I think that trade-off is worth it. The premise of the game is you are a like sort of John Wick sort of character, and the main gameplay mechanic is time doesn't move unless you, the player, do. And seeing as this is primarily a VR game, it's also a traditional style game, but I think it really works even better as a VR game. It really feels immersive, and the gameplay formula is hard to replicate, and I think because of that, hard to beat. The art style, fairly simple. Everything feels like and looks like it's made of glass, and while that doesn't leave a lot of potential beauty to be had in the game, I guess, it makes everything feel cohesive and gives everything personality. So for all those reasons, I'm going to put Super Hot in A tier. Now for Superliminal. It has a gameplay mechanic I don't think we've ever seen anything quite like it. It entirely involves perspective. And the best way I can sort of explain it is in one of the opening sections of the game, you are given a little chess piece. You can pick it up and sort of like move it around. And if you then drop it, however it looked in that perspective when you dropped it, if you move closer to it, it'll take that actual size. So like the form in which objects take and the size in which they are, you can manipulate by moving them around within your perspective, like bringing them closer, bringing them further away, all sorts of stuff that it's simply really hard to explain, but there isn't quite an experience like this. So for those reasons, I unfortunately am going to have to move the Stanley Parable down to B tier and put Superliminal in A tier. Because while it does tell not quite as compelling a narrative as the Stanley Parable, it's compelling enough that it can surpass the Stanley Parable with its gameplay. Final 2 games. First one is Team Fortress 2. It might not have been the first class-based first-person shooter, but I think it's the one that defined the genre. Art style and also any narrative to have in it and the world in which it takes place. Cartoonish, very exaggerated, which in turn gives it its personality. It's definitely not serious, even though the weapons in which you use are very much so in some aspects and others not so much. Definitely it's not the game it used to be, but at its core, the gameplay is fun, the characters are interesting, and the art style and soundtrack give it a lot of personality that is then further bolstered by the characters you play as. However, it doesn't really, the narrative of the world it takes place in is not really present in the game apart from the player versus enemy mode, man versus machine. So that does keep it from being S tier, but in all other regards, I think it's perfectly valid as an A tier game. And then finally, we have Undertale, one of the most well-known and critically acclaimed indie games of all time. Very heavily inspired by the RPG Earthbound for the Super Nintendo. Developed entirely by a single person. Well, with some help from other people, but mostly it was just Toby Fox. And similar to the Stanley Parable, the gameplay of Undertale is very reliant on choice and puts a great deal of emphasis on how what the player chooses to do or not to do greatly impacts the world in which the game takes place. It is given a lot of personality through its soundtrack, through its characterization, and through its art style. And I think all three of those really meld together very well to, again, build the personality of the game and really improve the player experience of the game. I can't really say too much more without spoiling the game's experience for yourself. It, along with the other things I'm putting in S tier, I very strongly urge you to experience it for yourself. But yeah, I would say out of a lot of the things we've talked about, very much deserving of being an S tier. Now we're in the final stretch. We're shifting gears back from games back into movies. Not nearly as many as before we shifted into games. But first of all, Barnyard. The Nickelodeon movie Barnyard. The animation style has definitely shown its age. The characters, while somewhat compelling, are not stellar by any means. And much like Paul Blart, or Click, or The Sorcerer's Apprentice, if you know what you're getting into going in, you're going to have fun. Otherwise, it's not super good. So I think for those reasons, I have to put it into C tier. The Big Lebowski, while it does maintain that sort of not serious, ridiculous aspect that Paul Blart and Barnyard and Click have, unlike those movies, I think it's objectively good. It doesn't have a lot of the pitfalls that those movies have. I think it's much more in line with movies like Airplane, where it plays really well and doesn't have too many flaws that are put on by the kind of movie that it is. So for those reasons, as well as the outlandish, ridiculous nature of the game, of the movie's narrative and the characters in it, I think it's an easy A tier. This next one's a kicker. Orson Welles' Citizen Kane. This movie, while it is technically very impressive, other than like the cinematography and a little bit of the mystery of the movie's story, it's not super compelling by today's standards. I know a lot of people would disagree with me in that regard, but I think that it's just the way it is. I don't think it's aged as well as a lot of people believe. And I think there are a lot of movies that can do what it does a little bit better. But at the same time, it is, for its time, a very impressive film. So I think for those reasons, I'm going to put it in B tier. Elf, I think is a much less enjoyable click. I don't think it's quite deserving of F tier, but I think to save time, I would summarize Elf as an Adam Sandler movie without the charm that Adam Sandler movies can have. So for those reasons, I will put it into D tier. Now for Nickelodeon's Good Burger, starring Kenan Thompson. This movie's not quite as good as a lot of people drummed it up to be, but it's still fun. Simple premise, simple character arcs. Overall, just a fun time. Very much in line with Paul Blart and Barnyard. Story's premise is pretty much a struggling fast food establishment plays the underdog against a much more powerful, much more resourceful chain, and it's a feel-good comedy. So C tier. Groundhog Day. I am so tired of hearing about Groundhog Day all the time. But to be fair, objectively, it handles like a time loop in a way not a lot of movies did before. And I think the way in which the movie was shot, the soundtrack of the movie, and the performances give it a lot of charm. So while I don't think it's quite good enough to go into A tier, I'm perfectly fine putting it into B. Next, we have Illuminations: The Lorax, which, while it has a very, not necessarily original, but it translates the Dr. Seuss art style decently into a more modern 3D environment, I think it loses a little bit of the magic that the original story had for the sake of being more marketable. And I think that dynamic is illustrated perfectly with the song How Bad Can I Be? Because originally in the movie's production, there was supposed to be a rock opera piece that more so focused on really what the Onceler was doing at that point in his arc was bad, and instead went for more of a lighthearted rock song just to make the movie more marketable, which I think was a real shame. So while it's a decently enjoyable movie, I suppose, there are definitely better ones than it. Some of the songs are good. I think it's definitely not anything to really write home about. So I think it belongs in D tier. Which brings us to our final piece of media we will be covering in this episode. The internet series Marble Hornets. This was one of, if not the most integral pieces of media behind the Slender phenomenon. It was a found footage style long-running series that documented a small collection of postgraduate students that had worked on a student film called Marble Hornets, but through one of the characters' mental illness and sort of curse infecting the other people in the group, it fell apart. And the series really deals with how these characters are trying to sort of beat this curse of the Slender Man. A lot of the cinematography techniques and effects and storytelling devices hadn't really been used too heavily before it, and I'm not sure if they ever will again. But at the same time, it's very apparent that it's a low-budget series. So for those reasons, although I think it's certainly worth a watch if you haven't seen it yet, I can't in good conscience put it any higher than C tier. And with that, we conclude today's ranking. Thank you all so much for listening in. We will be back next week with a different topic. And until then, I'll see you next time.